At my $100,000 wedding reception, my new in-laws thought it would be acceptable to shove my blue-collar father next to the swinging kitchen doors, treating him like hired help. When the man I had just married smirked at my father's humiliation, I did not run to the bathroom to cry. Instead, I took the microphone and publicly liquidated their entire bankrupt empire right before the cake cutting. I am Zoya, 35 years old, and I learned the hard way that marrying into a bougie image-obsessed family means you either shrink yourself to fit their aesthetic or you burn their facade to the ground. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who mistook your silence for weakness and tried to step on the people you love. The ballroom of the Oak Creek Country Club was dripping in white orchids and crystal chandeliers. It was the kind of lavish, over-the-top event that my fiancé Kendrick and his mother Vivian insisted we needed to maintain their high society image. The champagne was flowing freely, and a live jazz band was playing smoothly in the corner, filling the room with an air of sophisticated wealth. I was walking through the sea of guests in my custom-tailored silk gown, feeling the heavy weight of the diamond necklace Kendrick had bought me. Well, actually, it was a necklace his family company credit card had bought me. It was finally time for the father and daughter dance. I scanned the massive room looking for my dad Elias. I checked the VIP tables near the front of the stage where the mayor and Trey, my new brother-in-law, were holding court with a group of local investors. My dad was not there. I checked the tables reserved for the extended family, where Chloe, my white sister-in-law, was aggressively showing off her new Cartier watch to anyone who would pay attention to her. My dad was not there either. A cold flutter of panic started to rise in my chest. Then I heard the loud, sudden crash of a heavy tray hitting the swinging metal doors of the kitchen. I looked back into the darkest corner of the room near the busy service hallway. There he was. My father was seated at a tiny, wobbly overflow table that did not even have the matching floral centerpiece. It was a table meant for vendors, not for the father of the bride. It was shoved so close to the kitchen doors that every time a waiter rushed out with a fresh tray, the heavy metal door bumped the back of his chair. He was sitting completely alone, eating a plate of dry catered chicken. He was intentionally hunching his shoulders, trying to make himself as small as possible so he would not be in the way of the rushing staff. The disrespect hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I stopped dead in my tracks, holding the heavy silk of my skirt. This was Elias. This was the man whose hands were permanently calloused from 30 years of working double shifts at the City Transit Authority just so I could graduate from my historically black college completely debt-free. This was the proud single father who packed my lunches, braided my hair, and told me I could run the world. And right now, he was sitting in the shadows nervously adjusting the tight collar of his rented tuxedo, looking down at his lap, while people who had not worked a hard day in their lives drank top-shelf liquor in the center of the room. They felt superior to him simply because he wore a transit uniform while they wore designer suits. What they did not know was that I had always kept my massive net worth a secret from Kendrick's family. I preferred a modest lifestyle because I wanted a man to love me, not for my private equity portfolio. I marched over to the wedding planner who was frantically checking her clipboard near the multi-tiered cake table. I demanded to know why the father of the bride was sitting in the service corridor. She turned pale and stuttered, refusing to meet my eyes. After a tense moment, she whispered that Vivian had personally rearranged the seating chart that morning before I arrived at the venue. Vivian had told the planner that my father simply did not fit the visual profile of the VIP section and that his unpolished demeanor would make the wealthy investors uncomfortable. She had ordered them to put him in the back, where he would not ruin the aesthetic of the wedding photos. My blood turned to absolute ice. I spotted Kendrick laughing loudly with his groomsmen near a massive swan ice sculpture. I marched over, grabbed his arm tight enough to make him wince, and pulled him away from the crowd. I told him exactly what his mother had done and demanded we move my father to the head table immediately. I expected my new husband to be outraged. I expected him to drop his glass and rush to defend the man who had welcomed him into our home with open arms. Instead, Kendrick took a slow sip of his bourbon and chuckled. He actually laughed in my face. He touched my shoulder with a patronizing stroke and told me to calm down and stop making a scene over nothing. He said his mother's important country club friends were watching and we needed to maintain proper decorum. He looked me right in the eye and said my dad was probably far more comfortable back there in the dark anyway, because he did not know which fork to use for the salad course. Kendrick told me I needed to accept how things worked in his world and be grateful his family was hosting such a beautiful event for us. That was the exact moment the man I loved died in my eyes. He was not a supportive partner. He was a weak coward who valued his mother's fake prestige over my family's basic human dignity. I pulled away from his touch abruptly. I did not scream. I did not throw my expensive drink in his face. I just smoothed down the front skirt of my wedding dress and took a deep, steadying breath. The grieving, disappointed bride was instantly gone. The ruthless senior partner of a private equity firm had just clocked in for the evening. I turned my back on my new husband and walked away. I did not storm off or run in tears. I walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a woman who was about to dismantle an entire bloodline. My target was the massive floral-draped head table at the very front of the ballroom. This was where my father was supposed to be sitting right beside me. I navigated through the sea of swirling ball gowns and tailored tuxedos, ignoring the confused glances of guests who expected the bride to be glowing with joy. I reached the long table and scanned the elegant gold leaf place cards. Where my father's name should have been right next to my own seat, Vivian had placed the name of a local real estate developer she was desperately trying to impress. She had literally erased my father from the seat of honor to make room for a business connection. I reached across the silk table runner and snatched the heavy cardstock, crushing it in my fist. That is when Chloe decided to intervene. Chloe was Trey's wife, my new sister-in-law. She was a white woman who had married into this wealthy black family 5 years ago and had spent every waking moment since trying to prove she belonged in their elite circle. She did this primarily by adopting an aggressive, condescending attitude toward anyone she deemed lower class. She practically sprinted over to me in her tight designer dress, holding a crystal flute of champagne. She placed a manicured hand on my arm, feigning maternal concern. "Zoya, sweetie, please do not be so loud," she whispered with a patronizing smirk. "People are starting to stare. We just thought your dad would feel a little intimidated sitting up here with the mayor and Trey's corporate investors. We are actually doing him a favor. You know how unpolished he can get when he is nervous. We did not want him to use the wrong glass or feel out of place among people of a certain caliber." I looked at the hand resting on my arm. More specifically, I looked at the heavy gold and diamond Cartier watch glittering on her wrist. It was the Panthère de Cartier model. Retail price $25,000. I knew the exact price because I had seen the digital receipt for it just 3 weeks ago. What Chloe and Trey did not know was that their family logistics company was bleeding money. A month before the wedding, Kendrick had bragged to me about how successful his brother was. But my instincts as a private equity executive had told me otherwise. The math had never made sense. The luxury cars, the lavish vacations, the constant name-dropping, it all reeked of overcompensation. So I did what I do best. I quietly ran a background financial audit on their entire corporate structure through my firm. The results had been staggering. Trey's company had not turned a profit in 2 full years. They were drowning in toxic debt and dodging calls from creditors. And that $25,000 watch on Chloe's wrist was not bought with hard-earned wealth. She had siphoned the remaining payroll funds from the company accounts to buy designer accessories just to maintain the illusion of being old money. They were frauds. Every single one of them was living on stolen, borrowed time while looking down their noses at a man who had earned every honest penny he ever made. The urge to slap the champagne glass right out of her hand was overwhelming. I could have exposed her right then and there. I could have screamed that she was wearing stolen payroll on her arm while insulting my hardworking father. But I am not a messy woman. I play chess, not checkers. I knew the toasts were coming up in less than 20 minutes. Vivian would undoubtedly demand the microphone to address the entire room and stroke her own ego. That would be my perfect moment. So I forced the muscles in my face to relax. I gave Chloe a cold, empty smile and gently removed her hand from my arm. "You are absolutely right, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice dangerously soft. "I would hate for anyone to feel out of place tonight." I dropped the crushed place card into her champagne glass, letting it sink to the bottom, and walked away. I let her stand there looking confused while I headed toward the kitchen doors. I needed to see my dad one last time before I burned the circus to the ground. I walked past the glittering ice sculptures and the towering floral arrangements straight to the dark corner by the service doors. My father looked up as I approached, hastily wiping his mouth with a cheap paper napkin they had given him instead of the embroidered linen ones at the front tables. "Zoya, baby, what are you doing back here?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "You should be up front with your new husband. The photographer is going to want pictures." I pulled up a vendor chair and sat down right next to him, ruining the pristine drape of my custom silk gown against the sticky floor. I took his rough, calloused hand in mine. He tried to pull it away, embarrassed by his worn skin against my manicured fingers, but I held on tight. "I am exactly where I want to be, Dad," I told him. He offered me a warm, gentle smile that did not quite reach his tired eyes. He told me the chicken was actually pretty good and that he had a great view of the band from back here. He was lying. He was swallowing his own pride to protect my happiness. He had spent his entire life doing that. When the soles of his work boots wore thin, he put cardboard in them so he could afford my college textbooks. When the heating bill was too high, he wore 2 coats inside the house so my room could stay warm. He was a king disguised in a transit uniform, and these people had treated him like a stray dog. I promised him I would be right back and kissed his cheek. As I stood up, the band abruptly stopped playing. A sharp tapping sound echoed through the ballroom. I turned around. Vivian was standing in the dead center of the massive wooden dance floor holding the microphone. She was dripping in pearls and adjusting her designer evening gown, soaking up the attention of the 300 guests. It was time for the mother of the groom toast. The room went completely silent as everyone turned their attention to the matriarch of the fake empire. I stood near the edge of the shadows, crossing my arms. I was ready to let her dig her own grave. Vivian cleared her throat softly into the microphone. The soft chatter of the Oak Creek Country Club instantly died down. She offered the crowd a practiced camera-ready smile. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate the union of 2 very different worlds," she began. Her voice was smooth like poisoned honey. "As many of you know, our family has spent generations building a legacy of excellence and refinement. We hold ourselves to a certain standard." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the wealthy crowd before landing precisely on the dark corner where my father sat. "And that is why we are just so incredibly proud of Kendrick," she continued, placing a hand over her heart. "It takes a truly gracious Christian man to look past a person's lacking background and see their potential. When Kendrick told us he was marrying a girl from the wrong side of the tracks, a girl raised by a single city transit worker, we were admittedly concerned. But we decided to open our hearts and our checkbooks. We are thrilled to elevate Zoya into our world and give her a taste of the life she could only dream of. Please raise your glasses to my son, a true savior in a designer suit." The room erupted in polite applause. I watched Chloe lean over and whisper something to Trey, both of them laughing into their champagne flutes. But my eyes were fixed on Kendrick. The man I had just exchanged sacred vows with was beaming. He proudly lifted his glass toward his mother, soaking in the praise for being my wealthy rescuer. He did not look at me. He did not look at my father, who was now gripping the edge of his table with a look of pure, unadulterated shame. The switch inside me flipped permanently. Any lingering hesitation, any desperate hope that my husband was just being clueless vanished. The woman who had spent the last 2 years compromising to fit into this toxic family was gone. As the applause died down and the band began to play a soft melody, I stepped out of the shadows. I walked straight up to Kendrick. He turned to me with a wide, arrogant grin, expecting a kiss. Instead, I grabbed him by the lapels of his custom tuxedo and pulled him close. "We are going to the bridal suite right now," I whispered, my voice dangerously low. He tried to resist, but I turned on my heel and dragged him through the crowd. We pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the private suite, and I slammed them shut behind us, cutting off the jazz music. Kendrick immediately threw his hands up in exasperation. "What is wrong with you, Zoya?" he snapped aggressively, adjusting his jacket. "My mother just gave a beautiful speech, and you are acting like a lunatic. You are embarrassing me in front of the investors." I crossed my arms and stared at him. "She called me a charity case, Kendrick. She publicly humiliated my father in a room full of strangers. I am giving you exactly one chance to fix this. You are going to walk back out there, take that microphone, and apologize to my father. You are going to tell everyone that he is an honorable man, and that you are lucky to marry into his family." Kendrick let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He paced across the expensive Persian rug, shaking his head. "Are you out of your mind?" he demanded. "I am not apologizing to a transit worker for bringing him into a $100,000 party. You need to wake up, Zoya. Look around you. Look at the dress you are wearing. Look at the venue. You are entering a new tax bracket today. You should be down on your knees thanking my mother for letting you into our empire. Your dad is lucky he even got a plate of dry chicken in a place like this. He does not belong here, and frankly, neither do you unless you learn how to behave." He pointed a finger inches from my face. "Now you are going to touch up your makeup, go back out there and smile for the cameras. Do not ruin this for my family." I did not blink. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at him and saw exactly what he was. A fragile, insecure little boy hiding behind his mother's credit cards. He thought he held all the power because he believed the lie his family told the world. He truly believed he was the rich savior, and I was the poor, desperate girl. I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that made him step back. "You are absolutely right, Kendrick," I said softly. "I do need to wake up. And I need to address your mother's beautiful speech." I turned around and grabbed the heavy brass doorknob. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice suddenly laced with a hint of nervousness. "I am going to act like I belong in this tax bracket," I replied. I walked out of the bridal suite, leaving him standing there. I marched straight back into the ballroom. The guests were mingling, laughing, and eating the expensive appetizers. I bypassed the head table and walked directly to the bandstand. The lead singer was holding a wireless microphone, about to announce the cutting of the cake. I stepped up onto the small stage and held out my hand. He looked confused but handed it over without a word. I stood in the dead center of the stage. The bright spotlight hit the diamonds around my neck. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp sound echoed through the massive room, silencing the crowd instantly. 300 faces turned to look at me. Vivian was standing near the bar holding a martini, looking incredibly smug. She assumed I was about to give a tearful thank you speech confirming everything she had just said. Chloe and Trey were watching me with matching expressions of boredom. I took a deep breath. I looked past all the fake smiles and designer clothes straight to the dark corner by the kitchen doors. My father was looking at me, his posture rigid. I gave him a small nod. Then I turned my attention to the matriarch of this fraudulent dynasty. It was time for the corporate execution. I looked right at Vivian and smiled. It was the kind of smile a predator gives before snapping its jaws shut. "Thank you, Vivian," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Thank you for such a revealing toast. You spoke beautifully about your family's legacy of excellence and refinement. You mentioned how your empire is graciously elevating me into a world of wealth." The crowd murmured in agreement, raising their glasses again. Vivian stood taller, taking a modest sip of her martini. "It is truly fascinating to hear you talk about this empire, Vivian." I continued, pacing slowly across the small stage. "Because according to the federal bankruptcy filings, your empire has been entirely insolvent for the last 8 months. The entire ballroom went dead silent, the kind of silence where you could hear a pin drop on the carpet. The polite smiles froze on the faces of the country club elite. Vivian's martini glass stopped halfway to her mouth. Her face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. I did not stop. I had the floor, and I was going to use it. "That is right. Everyone, I announced, scanning the shocked faces of the local politicians and investors. The sprawling estate Vivian brags about has 2 defaulted mortgages. The country club memberships are 4 months past due. This beautiful $100,000 wedding reception. It was entirely funded by a high-interest credit card that is currently maxed out. There is no empire. There is only a mountain of toxic debt and a desperate attempt to keep up appearances. The whispers erupted immediately. The investors Vivian had invited began muttering aggressively to one another. Kendrick, who had been standing near the bar, suddenly broke into a run toward the stage. "Zoya, shut your mouth!" he yelled, his face flushed with panic and rage. "Give me the microphone right now." I took a step back out of his reach. The lead singer of the band, realizing exactly what was happening, quickly stepped between Kendrick and the stage, crossing his massive arms to block my furious husband. I turned my attention to the head table. Trey was gripping the edge of the tablecloth, looking like he was about to vomit. Chloe was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "And then there is the crown jewel of the family portfolio," I said, pointing directly at Trey. "The logistics company. Trey, you have been telling everyone tonight that business is booming. You just tried to solicit investment capital from the mayor himself. But the truth is, your company has not turned a profit in 2 full years. Your trucks are being repossessed, and your warehouse rent is delinquent." Trey stood up, knocking his chair backward. "That is a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You do not know what you are talking about. You are just a mid-level manager." I ignored him and locked eyes with Chloe. "And Chloe, sweetie," I said, mimicking the patronizing tone she had used on me earlier. "I really admire how dedicated you are to the family brand. It takes a lot of nerve to siphon the last remaining payroll funds from your employees just to buy that $25,000 Cartier watch on your wrist." 300 heads swiveled to look at Chloe. She gasped and instantly grabbed her left wrist, trying to pull the sleeve of her dress down over the gold and diamond watch. It was too late. Everyone had seen it. "This is defamation," Kendrick screamed, trying to push past the bandleader. "Someone cut the power to the sound system. She is crazy." "I am not crazy, Kendrick," I said calmly. "I am just a woman who does her homework. You all thought I was some naive girl you could use to make yourselves look charitable. You assumed because I lived quietly and did not flaunt designer labels that I was poor. But you never actually asked what I do for a living. You never asked what my title is at the financial firm I work for." I pulled my smartphone from the hidden pocket of my wedding gown. Earlier this evening, while I was getting my hair done, I had the AV technician sync my phone to the venue's projection system. I tapped the screen. Behind me, a massive digital projector flared to life, casting a glaring white light against the back wall of the ballroom. A highly confidential, legally binding financial document appeared on the wall. It was blown up so large that even the people in the back row could read the bold print. "I am not a mid-level manager," I announced, my voice echoing over the growing chaos in the room. "I am the senior partner and majority shareholder of Apex Capital Management. We are a private equity firm that specializes in corporate restructuring and distressed asset liquidation." I clicked a button on my phone and the slide changed. It showed a clear, undeniable transfer of ownership. "3 weeks ago, my firm quietly purchased all of your family's defaulted corporate and personal debt from your creditors," I explained, watching the absolute devastation wash over Kendrick's face. "I own the mortgage on your mother's mansion. I own the lien on Trey's logistics company. I even own the financing contract on the leased luxury cars you drove here tonight. I am your single largest creditor. I own your entire fake empire." Vivian dropped her martini glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, but nobody paid attention. She stumbled backward, grabbing a chair for support. She was hyperventilating, staring at the projection on the wall that explicitly detailed her financial ruin. Kendrick stopped fighting the bandleader. His arms dropped to his sides. He looked up at me with a pathetic mixture of shock and sheer terror. "Zoya," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Zoya, please. What are you doing?" I stepped to the edge of the stage, looking down at the man who had mocked the father who sacrificed everything for me. "I am doing exactly what you told me to do, Kendrick," I said, my tone ice cold. "I am acting like I belong in my tax bracket. I stood there at the massive head table, my knuckles turning white as I gripped my father's discarded place card. The sheer nerve of Vivian to replace his name with a local real estate developer was sickening. The head table was draped in expensive white silk and covered in cascading arrangements of rare white orchids. It was a space designed to showcase power and prestige, and in their minds my father did not fit the aesthetic. Before I could even process the full weight of that blatant disrespect, Chloe decided it was her moment to step in and shine. Chloe was Trey's wife, my new white sister-in-law. She had married into Kendrick's family 5 years ago, and from day one she had treated her proximity to black wealth as some kind of supreme personality trait. She was the kind of woman who constantly name-dropped black designers, overused cultural slang she barely understood, and went out of her way to be aggressively condescending to anyone she considered lower class. It was her desperate, transparent way of securing her own standing in Vivian's elite circle. She needed someone to look down on so she could feel like she belonged at the top. Seeing me standing there vibrating with quiet fury, Chloe saw an opportunity to play the peacemaker and score points with the matriarch. She stood up from her chair, smoothing down the front of her form-fitting emerald green designer gown. She picked up her crystal flute of champagne and walked over to me, leaning in uncomfortably close. She plastered on a deeply patronizing smirk, the kind of smile reserved for a misbehaving child throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "Zoya, sweetie, please do not be so loud," she whispered, placing a perfectly manicured hand on my bare shoulder. "People are starting to stare." I looked down at her hand and then back up to her face. I had not said a single word since I walked up to the table. I had not raised my voice or made a scene. So her immediately telling me not to be loud was a classic microaggression pulled straight out of her usual playbook. She wanted to frame me as the angry, irrational bride so she could play the calm, sophisticated savior. "We just thought your dad would feel a little intimidated sitting up here," she continued, her tone dripping with fake maternal sympathy. "I mean, look around, Zoya. We have the mayor right over there. Trey has his top corporate investors flying in all the way from Chicago. We are actually doing your father a huge favor. You know how unpolished he can get when he is nervous. We did not want him to feel out of place or embarrass himself in front of people of a certain caliber." Unpolished. The word hung in the air between us like a foul odor. She was calling the man who meticulously ironed his transit uniform every single night unpolished. She was talking about a man who had more integrity in his calloused pinky finger than this entire ballroom full of pretentious frauds had in their collective bloodlines. My father Elias was the kind of man who held doors open for strangers, who looked people in the eye when he spoke to them, and who never took a single dime he did not earn with his own 2 hands. He had spent his life working double shifts in the grueling city heat just so I could have a better life. But to Chloe, he was just a blue-collar worker who might use the wrong fork for the salad course and ruin their precious high society aesthetic. Trey leaned back in his chair, swirling his expensive scotch, and chimed in to back up his wife. "Chloe is right, Zoya," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Kendrick and my mother just wanted everything to be perfect for the photographs. Your dad is a good guy, but he does not exactly blend in with the country club crowd. Just let it go and sit down, drink some champagne, and enjoy the party we paid for." I looked at Trey, the supposed brilliant chief executive officer of the family logistics empire. Then I looked back at Chloe. As she lifted her champagne flute to take a sip, the sleeve of her silk gown slipped back, revealing a heavy gold and diamond watch glittering under the crystal chandeliers. It was a Panthère de Cartier watch. The retail price was exactly $25,000. A cold wave of absolute clarity washed over me, pushing away the hot sting of anger. What Trey and Chloe did not know, what nobody in this room knew, was that I had spent the last 3 weeks conducting a brutal forensic financial audit of their entire family portfolio. Kendrick's family loved to boast about their generational wealth. They loved to look down on my family because my father worked for the city, but numbers never lie. My firm, Apex Capital Management, specialized in distressed assets and corporate restructuring. Out of pure curiosity before the wedding, I had my team run a quiet background check on Trey's business. The results had been staggering. Kendrick's family was the very definition of distressed. Trey's logistics company had not made a single dollar of actual profit in over 2 years. They were drowning in high-interest corporate debt, dodging calls from angry suppliers, and facing massive lawsuits from unpaid independent contractors. And that beautiful $25,000 Cartier watch currently sitting on Chloe's wrist had not been purchased with hard-earned wealth. She had bought it using misappropriated funds siphoned directly from the logistics company payroll account, just days before their corporate accounts were flagged by the bank. They were literal thieves. They were wearing stolen money while looking down on a man who worked an honest, grueling job. The hypocrisy was so thick I could practically choke on it. The urge to expose them right then and there was a living, breathing thing inside my chest. I wanted to slap the crystal glass right out of Chloe's hand. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs that they were all frauds living on borrowed time and stolen credit. I wanted to watch the smug, condescending smile slide right off Chloe's perfectly contoured face when I told the mayor and the investors exactly where Trey's capital was really going. But I am a professional. I negotiate multi-million-dollar corporate liquidations for a living. I know that if you show your hand too early, you lose the maximum impact of the strike. I needed a bigger audience. I needed Vivian to take the stage first for the toasts. I needed her to dig the hole as deep as possible before I buried them all in it, so I took a slow, deep breath. I channeled every ounce of executive discipline I possessed. I looked Chloe dead in the eyes and offered her a chilling, utterly empty smile. I slowly reached up and removed her hand from my shoulder. My grip was just tight enough to make her flinch and take a nervous step back. "You are so thoughtful, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly steady and quiet. "It is truly amazing how much effort you put into maintaining appearances. I would hate for anyone to feel out of place tonight, or for anyone to be exposed for who they truly are." Chloe blinked, looking slightly unnerved by my calm demeanor. She opened her mouth to speak, but I did not give her the chance. I took my father's crushed place card and dropped it right into her champagne glass. The heavy cardstock splashed the expensive liquor over the rim and sank to the bottom, ruining her drink. "Keep an eye on the time for me, sweetie," I whispered, nodding toward her wrist. "We would not want your borrowed time to run out before the cake is cut." I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving her staring down at her ruined champagne with a confused and genuinely nervous expression. Trey sat up straight, looking suddenly uneasy, but I was already moving across the room. I did not look back. I navigated through the sea of wealthy, oblivious guests, heading straight for the dark corner near the kitchen doors where my father was waiting. I needed to look him in the eye and ground myself before the real show began. I pulled up a small wooden vendor chair next to my father and sat down, ignoring how the rough wood snagged the delicate silk of my custom wedding gown. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a caged bird, but my face remained an unreadable mask. A few minutes ago, I could have easily thrown my glass of champagne right into Chloe's smug, perfectly contoured face. I could have screamed at the top of my lungs and caused a massive scene in front of the mayor and all the local politicians. That is exactly what they expected from me. They expected the girl from the wrong side of the tracks to lose her temper and prove their horrible stereotypes right. But I did not scream. I did not throw a drink. I had just smiled coldly at my sister-in-law and walked away because my ammunition was entirely too valuable to waste on a minor skirmish. I was saving my artillery for the actual war. As I sat there in the dim lighting of the service corridor, looking at my father who was humbly eating his dry catered chicken, my mind drifted back to exactly 3 weeks ago. That was the day I discovered the rotting foundation of my future in-law's entire existence. Kendrick had always been vague about the specifics of his family wealth. He threw around buzzwords like generational assets and corporate portfolios, but he never actually explained what Trey did all day at the logistics company. One evening, Kendrick left a folder of financial documents on our kitchen counter. It was a notice of default from a minor vendor. My instincts as a private equity executive immediately kicked into high gear. I do not just work in finance. I am a senior partner at Apex Capital Management. My entire career is built on analyzing distressed assets, finding the hidden leaks in corporate structures, and liquidating bankrupt companies. I have a natural talent for following the money. So the next morning, I went into my corner office overlooking the city skyline, locked the door, and ran a comprehensive background audit on Kendrick's family trust and Trey's logistics business. What I found in those databases was not just financial mismanagement, it was an active, glaring fraud. Trey's company was a complete house of cards. He was taking out massive high-interest loans just to pay off the interest on older defaulted loans. His freight trucks were heavily mortgaged and his warehouse properties were facing imminent foreclosure. But the most disgusting discovery was the personal embezzlement. I tracked a series of wire transfers originating from the logistics company payroll account. The money meant to pay their hard-working truck drivers was being quietly funneled into a private offshore LLC. That LLC was registered under Chloe's maiden name. And just 3 days before I ran the audit, that exact LLC had authorized a $25,000 payment to a luxury jeweler. It was the exact retail price of the Panthère de Cartier watch that was currently sitting on Chloe's wrist while she insulted my father. They were not old money. They were criminals wearing designer suits playing dress-up with stolen funds. And I knew the moment I married Kendrick under our state laws, their massive toxic debt would try to attach itself to my pristine financial portfolio. So I took action. Through a series of blind proxy companies, my firm quietly purchased every single piece of their defaulted debt. I became their landlord, their auto financier, and their primary creditor, all without them knowing my name. I looked at my dad. He wiped his mouth with a cheap paper napkin and offered me a warm, gentle smile. "Zoya, baby," he said, his voice thick with concern. "You should not be sitting back here in the dark with me. It is your wedding day. Go out there and dance with your new husband. Do not worry about an old man like me. I am doing just fine right here." I felt a sharp, painful lump form in my throat. I looked at his hands. They were deeply calloused, scarred from decades of pulling levers and fixing transit rails. Those hands had built my entire world. They had paid for my college textbooks, they had braided my hair before school, and they had held me when I cried. He possessed a quiet, unbreakable dignity that nobody in this glittering ballroom could ever comprehend. I wanted to tell him everything right then and there. I wanted to lean across the wobbly overflow table and tell him that he did not need to make himself small for these people. I wanted to tell him that I legally owned the very building Vivian lived in, and that I could throw them all out on the street with a single phone call. I wanted to assure him that he was the richest man in the room because his conscience was entirely clean. But I forced myself to bite my tongue. If I told him my plan, he would try to stop me. My father was too kind, too forgiving. He would tell me to take the high road and let God handle their punishment. But I was not feeling very forgiving tonight, and I was perfectly willing to be the instrument of their karma. "I am not going anywhere, Dad," I told him softly, resting my manicured hand over his rough knuckles. "I am exactly where I need to be. Just sit with me for a few more minutes." We sat together in comfortable silence, watching the parade of fake wealth swirl around the ballroom floor. I watched Kendrick laughing loudly with his groomsmen, acting like he owned the world. He had not even looked in my direction since I walked away from the head table. He was completely, perfectly content to let his family disrespect me and my father. As long as it kept his precious social status intact, he had chosen his side. I watched Vivian floating from table to table, soaking up the compliments on the lavish floral arrangements and the top-shelf liquor. She was practically glowing with smug satisfaction, believing she had successfully put me and my father in our place. She thought she had established the pecking order. She thought I was just a grateful little charity case who would quietly accept whatever scraps of respect she decided to throw my way. I breathed in the scent of the expensive white orchids filling the room. The trap was fully set. The steel jaws were open, and Kendrick's family was happily dancing right into the center of it. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to pull the lever. Suddenly, the upbeat jazz music faded out. The low hum of conversation began to quiet down as a sharp, distinct tapping sound echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system. I looked past the swirling skirts and tailored suits toward the center of the massive wooden dance floor. Vivian was standing in the bright spotlight holding a wireless microphone. She was adjusting the heavy pearl necklace resting against her collarbone, standing tall with an air of absolute superiority. The room fell into a respectful hush. It was time for the mother of the groom to deliver her toast. I squeezed my father's hand one last time. This was it. The battle lines were drawn, the ammunition was loaded, and my target was stepping directly into my crosshairs. I leaned back in my wooden chair and smiled in the dark, waiting for her to speak. Vivian tapped her manicured fingernail against the metal grill of the microphone. The sharp, rhythmic sound echoed through the vaulted ceilings of the Oak Creek Country Club, instantly silencing the room. The last few murmurs faded away, and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes came to a halt. 300 pairs of eyes locked onto the matriarch of the family. She stood dead center on the polished mahogany dance floor, bathing in the harsh white glare of the spotlight. She wore a custom silver evening gown that caught the light with every subtle movement, and a heavy string of South Sea pearls rested perfectly against her collarbone. She looked every inch the wealthy, sophisticated society woman she so desperately pretended to be. I sat in the shadows near the kitchen doors, keeping my hand firmly over my father's rough knuckles. From my vantage point, the entire scene looked like a beautifully directed stage play. The massive floral centerpieces overflowing with white orchids and hydrangeas framed Vivian like royalty. The guests sitting at the front tables were completely enraptured. I watched the local mayor, a state senator, and several prominent real estate developers lean forward in their gilded chairs, offering Vivian their undivided attention. They were looking at her with the deep ingrained respect that society reserves exclusively for old money. What they did not know was that the woman holding the microphone did not have a single dime of actual liquidity to her name. As I looked at Vivian soaking up the adoration, I did not see a powerful matriarch. I saw a walking, breathing balance sheet of catastrophic toxic debt. Welcome, family, friends, and esteemed guests. Vivian began, her voice smooth and practiced. She had the cadence of a seasoned politician, projecting warmth while maintaining a calculated distance. Thank you all for joining us on this magnificent evening. Looking out at this room, seeing so many pillars of our community gathered here together, it truly warms my heart. It is a testament to the bonds we have built and the legacy our family has carefully maintained for generations. I felt my father shift uncomfortably in his wooden chair next to me. He kept his eyes cast downward, staring at the cheap paper napkin resting on his lap. He felt utterly out of place in this room full of people congratulating themselves on their own perceived superiority. I squeezed his hand a little tighter, silently anchoring him. He had nothing to be ashamed of. He was the only honest man in the building. Vivian smiled graciously, acknowledging a few specific faces in the crowd. She nodded to a prominent local judge, thanking him for his long-standing friendship with her late husband. It took every ounce of executive discipline I possessed not to laugh out loud right there in the dark. I knew for a fact that the very same judge she was smiling at was scheduled to preside over her emergency foreclosure hearing in exactly 28 days. She was literally buttering up the man who was going to authorize the seizure of her sprawling colonial estate, but she was entirely oblivious to the trap closing around her. My family has always believed that to whom much is given, much is required. Vivian continued gracefully, pacing across the stage. Her silver gown swept across the floor behind her. We have always held ourselves to the highest possible standard. We understand that our name carries weight in this city. It carries an expectation of excellence, of philanthropy, and of unwavering class. At the head table, Trey nodded solemnly in agreement, swirling his expensive scotch. Chloe leaned against him, resting her chin on her hand, making sure the diamond Cartier watch on her wrist was perfectly angled to catch the light of the chandeliers. They were both playing their supporting roles flawlessly. They were the brilliant, successful older brother and the stylish, devoted sister-in-law. In reality, they were two desperate fraudsters hiding behind a failing logistics company, praying their creditors did not show up to repossess their leased luxury cars before the cake was cut. And maintaining that standard is not always easy, Vivian said, lowering her voice slightly to draw the audience in. It requires sacrifice. It requires a firm hand and a clear vision. When we began planning this wedding, Kendrick and I wanted to ensure that every single detail reflected who we are. We wanted an evening that was not just a party, but a true representation of our place in this world. She gestured expansively with her free hand, indicating the lavish ballroom, the towering ice sculptures, the imported champagne, and the 10-piece jazz band. She was taking full credit for the $100,000 spectacle surrounding us. She wanted everyone in that room to believe that she had effortlessly written a check for all of this out of her massive trust fund. The reality was far more pathetic. The deposit for the venue, the catering, the flowers, and the band had been paid for using a high-limit corporate credit card attached to Trey's business account. The card had been maxed out the moment the florist ran the final charge. And because my private equity firm had recently acquired the debt portfolio of the bank that issued that credit card, I was technically the one funding the entire illusion. Vivian was bragging about a party that I legally owned. I shifted my gaze to Kendrick. My newly minted husband was standing near the edge of the dance floor holding a crystal tumbler of bourbon. He was gazing up at his mother with absolute pure adoration. His chest was puffed out, his custom tuxedo fitting perfectly across his shoulders. He looked like the golden prince of a wealthy dynasty. He was completely intoxicated by the validation of the room. He needed this performance just as much as Vivian did. He needed these people to look at him and see a wealthy titan of industry. Because underneath the tailored suit, he was just an insecure man drowning in financial ruin. As I watched him smiling at his mother's lies, the last remaining shred of affection I held for him evaporated into the cold, air-conditioned air of the ballroom. I had spent 2 years loving a ghost. I had fallen in love with a charming, thoughtful man who never actually existed. The real Kendrick was standing right in front of me, perfectly willing to let his family erase my father and trample on my boundaries, as long as it kept his country club membership intact. Vivian paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment to ensure every single person was hanging on her next word. She took a deep breath, placing her hand delicately over her heart. She turned her body slightly so she was facing Kendrick's direction. The spotlight followed her, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished floor. "Which brings me to the man of the hour," Vivian said, her voice swelling with manufactured emotion. "My youngest son, Kendrick." The crowd offered a polite murmur of agreement. A few people clapped softly. Kendrick bowed his head slightly, playing the role of the humble, successful groom. "From the day he was born, Kendrick has been the shining light of our family," Vivian continued. "He embodies everything we stand for. He is brilliant, he is driven, and above all, he has a heart that is entirely too generous for his own good. He has always been a protector. He has always sought out those who need help and offered them a hand up." I leaned forward in my chair, the heavy silk of my wedding gown rustling against the sticky floor of the service corridor. My eyes narrowed. I knew exactly where this was going. She was carefully laying down the foundation for the ultimate insult. She was not just praising her son, she was setting up a narrative. She was painting Kendrick as a wealthy, benevolent savior, so that she could seamlessly transition into painting me as the poor, desperate charity case he had rescued from the gutter. I felt my father's hand twitch under mine. Even he could hear the condescension dripping from Vivian's honeyed words. He looked up at the stage, his jaw tightening. I watched Vivian take a slow, deliberate breath, preparing to deliver the punchline to her grand joke. She was about to publicly attempt to strip away my dignity and brand my family as lower-class peasants who should be grateful for the scraps falling from her table. She thought she was untouchable, standing there in her silver gown and pearls. She had absolutely no idea that I had my finger hovering right over the detonation button, ready to blow her fake empire completely off the map. Vivian adjusted her microphone, offering a smile so deeply patronizing it could have frozen boiling water. When Kendrick first told us about Zoya, she began, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. I must admit, my husband and I were incredibly hesitant. We are a family built on legacy, on generation after generation of carefully cultivated success. And then our son brings home a young woman from, well, let us be brutally honest, the wrong side of the tracks. A low collective murmur rippled through the front tables. Several of Vivian's elite country club friends exchanged knowing glances, sipping their expensive champagne with thinly veiled amusement. I felt my father stiffen in his wooden chair beside me. His broad shoulders, which had carried the heavy weight of my entire world for 35 years, seemed to cave inward under the oppressive weight of her public humiliation. She was a girl raised by a single father who spent his entire adult life riding city buses. Vivian continued shaking her perfectly styled head with an expression of mock sympathy. A girl who had never known the comfort of a sprawling estate, who had never experienced the basic refinement of true high society. It is no secret that her background is completely devoid of the privilege and education we take for granted every single day. She was quite frankly a charity case in need of a guiding hand. The sheer unadulterated audacity of the phrase charity case leaving her mouth made my blood run entirely cold. The words hung in the air toxic and suffocating. I managed private equity portfolios worth more than the gross domestic product of small island nations. I sat in executive boardrooms with actual titans of industry who paid thousands of dollars an hour just for my financial advice. Yet here was a woman whose only actual asset was a maxed-out corporate credit card standing on a stage I legally owned, calling me a charity case. But Kendrick Vivian said, raising her martini glass toward my husband. My sweet, generous Kendrick saw past all her obvious limitations. He told me, Mother, she just needs someone to show her the proper way. She just needs the polish of a good family to smooth out her rough edges. And as devout Christians, how could we possibly turn away a soul so desperately in need of uplifting? She placed a delicate hand over her heart, playing the flawless role of the benevolent missionary who had just rescued a stray animal from the pound. We opened our heavy mahogany doors to Zoya. We welcomed her to our formal dinner table. We patiently taught her how to navigate a world of wealth she could never have imagined on her own. We provided her with a taste of real success, showing her what it means to be part of an empire. I almost laughed out loud at the absolute absurdity of her narrative. Navigating a world of wealth. Vivian had bounced 3 separate checks to this very country club in the last 6 months. Chloe was sitting right over there wearing stolen corporate payroll on her wrist. Trey was actively dodging collections calls from the federal government. They were drowning in a shallow kiddie pool of toxic debt while trying to teach me how to swim in the ocean. They were all so deeply committed to this collective delusion. They desperately needed to tear my family down to make their crumbling foundation feel secure. So today is not just a celebration of a marriage, Vivian announced, her voice rising to a triumphant theatrical crescendo. It is a celebration of our family's boundless grace. We are officially adopting Zoya into a tax bracket and a lifestyle she could never have achieved on her own. Let us raise our glasses to Kendrick, a man so secure in his own immense wealth and standing that he was willing to stoop down and pull someone else up from the dirt. To Kendrick, the crowd echoed back a chorus of wealthy, oblivious voices, raising their crystal glasses in a unified toast to my husband's supposed charity. The live jazz band struck up a soft, triumphant chord to punctuate the grand finale of her speech. Vivian took a modest sip of her martini, basking in the warm applause of her peers. She looked out into the crowded ballroom, searching the faces waiting for me to step forward into the light, with grateful tears in my eyes, to thank her for allowing me to breathe their rarefied air. I did not move. I remained perfectly seated in the shadows next to the swinging kitchen doors. The darkness concealed the absolute lethal fury burning in my eyes. I looked at the man I had just exchanged sacred vows with. Kendrick was grinning from ear to ear, accepting enthusiastic pats on the back from his groomsmen. He was eagerly soaking up the praise, reveling in the false narrative that he was my wealthy savior. He had stood there and listened to his mother call my father a bus-riding peasant. He had listened to her call me a pathetic charity case. And he had smiled. He did not just fail to defend me, he completely agreed with her. Zoya, baby. My father whispered, his rough voice cracking slightly. I am so sorry. I should not have come tonight. I am just embarrassing you in front of your new family. I turned to look at Elias. He was staring down at his scarred hands. The man who had sacrificed his youth, his sleep, And his body, to make sure I never wanted for anything, was now apologizing for his own existence. He was being treated as a cautionary tale of poverty for a room full of country club snobs, and he was blaming himself. A single tear slipped down my father's weathered cheek, catching the dim light of the service corridor. He quickly wiped it away, but I had already seen it. That single tear broke something profound and irreversible inside of me. It shattered the very last remaining ounce of grace I had reserved for Kendrick and his toxic bloodline. I squeezed my father's hand so tightly my manicured nails bit into my own palms. "You are the only person in this entire building who is actually worth anything," I told him, my voice trembling with a suppressed rage so intense it felt like physical pain. "Do not ever apologize for being my father. Do you hear me? You are a king." He looked up at me, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. There was no longer any room for hesitation. There was no more biting my tongue for the sake of keeping the peace. The polite, accommodating bride they thought they had married into their fake family was dead and buried. I let go of my father's hand and slowly stood up, smoothing out the front of my heavy silk gown. I was going to rip their imaginary empire apart, brick by miserable brick, and I was going to make absolutely certain they felt every single ounce of the humiliation they had just inflicted on my father. I watched Vivian lower the microphone gracefully, accepting the applause like a queen receiving tribute from her loyal subjects. The band seamlessly transitioned into a soft instrumental version of a popular romantic ballad. The guests began to turn back to their meals, the tension in the room instantly dissolving into polite conversation. They had witnessed the public execution of my family's dignity, and they were completely unfazed. To them, it was just dinner theater. I looked at Kendrick again. He had moved from his spot near the edge of the dance floor and was currently shaking hands with the mayor, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. He was accepting their quiet congratulations for being such a noble, charitable man. He was entirely comfortable with the narrative his mother had just spun. He wanted to be the rich savior, rescuing the poor, desperate girl from the gutter. It stroked his fragile ego in a way that simply loving me never could. Then I looked back at the swinging kitchen doors. My father had not moved. He was still staring down at the cheap paper napkin on his lap, his broad shoulders slumped in defeat. The man who had spent 30 years repairing subway tracks, the man who had worked through holidays and weekends, so I could attend an expensive university without taking out a single student loan, was sitting there trying to make himself invisible. He was swallowing his pride, suppressing his own anger just so he would not ruin what he thought was the happiest day of my life. A profound icy calm washed over me. The hot tears of humiliation that had been threatening to spill over my eyelashes instantly evaporated. The switch in my soul did not just flip, it broke off completely. The heartbroken bride, grieving the illusion of a happy marriage, vanished into the dark corner of that country club. In her place stood the woman who ruthless billionaires paid thousands of dollars an hour to dismantle failing corporations. The executive had officially stepped out and she was ready to go to work. I stood up from the vendor chair, my heavy silk gown rustling against the floor. "Dad," I said, my voice low and steady, "stay right here. Do not move." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with sudden alarm. "Zoya, baby, please do not make a scene," he whispered, reaching for my hand. "It is not worth it. I am fine, really. Just go enjoy your party." I gently pulled my hand away from his grasp. "It is not a party anymore, Dad," I told him. "It is a liquidation." I turned my back on the kitchen doors and began walking toward the center of the ballroom. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, deliberate stride of a predator that had already cornered its prey. The intricate lace and heavy silk of my custom gown dragged across the polished hardwood floor, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. I kept my eyes locked on Kendrick. He was standing near the towering multi-tiered wedding cake, laughing loudly at a joke the mayor had just told. He held a fresh crystal tumbler of bourbon in his hand, looking completely relaxed. He did not even notice me approaching until I was standing less than 2 feet away from him. "Zoya," he said, his smile faltering slightly as he took in my cold expression. "Where have you been hiding? The photographer has been looking all over for you. We need to get some shots with the investors before they leave." I did not answer him. Instead, I reached out and grabbed him by the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo. I did not care that the mayor and several prominent local politicians were standing right there watching us with wide eyes. I pulled Kendrick forward with a sudden violent jerk, forcing him to stumble slightly off balance. "We are going to the bridal suite," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that only he could hear. "Right now." He tried to pull away, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Zoya, stop it. You are wrinkling my jacket," he hissed, glancing nervously at the mayor. "What is wrong with you? People are staring." I tightened my grip, twisting the expensive Italian fabric in my fists. "I do not care who is staring, Kendrick. You are going to walk with me to the bridal suite quietly, or I am going to cause a scene right here next to the cake that will make the local evening news. Your choice." Kendrick swallowed hard, the arrogant smirk finally sliding off his face. He recognized the tone in my voice. It was the tone I used when a negotiation was over and I was laying down an ultimatum. He nodded once, a tight, jerky movement. "Fine," he muttered, prying my hands off his lapels. "But you are acting completely irrational." I turned on my heel and began walking toward the heavy mahogany doors that led to the private bridal suite at the back of the venue. Kendrick followed closely behind me, muttering under his breath about how I was ruining the aesthetic of the evening. I ignored the confused stares of the guests as we pushed past the tables. I ignored Chloe, who tried to catch my arm as I walked by. I had tunnel vision. I had exactly one objective left before I burned this entire circus to the ground. I needed to give Kendrick one final opportunity to prove he had a spine. I needed to know with absolute certainty that the man I married was completely entirely beyond saving. I shoved Kendrick into the center of the luxurious bridal suite and slammed the heavy mahogany doors shut behind us. The heavy click of the brass deadbolt sliding into place instantly cut off the muffled sounds of the jazz band and the clinking glasses from the reception hall. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. The suite was a masterpiece of high society excess, featuring plush velvet sofas, a massive crystal chandelier, and a silver tray holding untouched bottles of vintage champagne. It was the perfect, beautiful cage for the ugly conversation that was about to happen. Kendrick stumbled slightly, recovering his balance, and immediately began furiously smoothing down the front of his custom tuxedo jacket. His face was flushed with an ugly mixture of embarrassment and rising anger. "What is wrong with you?" he demanded, his voice echoing sharply against the silk-covered walls. "You are completely ruining the aesthetic of the evening. We have the mayor and 3 state senators sitting out there. You cannot just grab me by the lapels and drag me away like a child." I stood by the door, blocking his exit. I crossed my arms over my chest and stared at him. The man standing in front of me was a complete stranger. The charming, attentive fiancé I thought I knew had completely evaporated, leaving behind a fragile, arrogant boy hiding behind his mother's imaginary bank accounts. "Your mother just stood on a stage and called me a charity case, Kendrick," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "She publicly humiliated my father in front of 300 people. She called him a peasant who rides the bus. And you stood there holding your drink and smiled." Kendrick threw his hands up in exasperation, pacing across the expensive Persian rug. "You are being completely overly sensitive, Zoya. You are twisting her words to make yourself the victim. My mother gave a beautiful, gracious speech. She was welcoming you into the family. She was highlighting how far you have come and how generous we are being by embracing you. You should be flattered, not throwing a massive temper tantrum in the middle of our $100,000 reception." Flattered, I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. "You think I should be flattered that your family views me as a stray dog you rescued from the pound? I am giving you exactly one chance to fix this, Kendrick. One single chance. You are going to turn around, walk back out through those doors, take that microphone from the bandstand, and apologize to my father. You are going to tell that entire room that Elias is an honorable, hard-working man, and that you are the one who is lucky to be marrying into his family." Kendrick stopped pacing. He planted his feet and let out a harsh, mocking laugh that sent a chill straight down my spine. He shook his head, looking at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "Are you completely out of your mind?" he asked, stepping toward me. I am not going out there to apologize to a transit worker for inviting him to the nicest party he will ever see in his entire miserable life. He is lucky my mother even allowed him to have a plate of food at this venue. My hands curled into tight fists at my sides, but I did not raise my voice. I let him keep digging his own grave. You need to wake up, Zoya. Kendrick continued, pointing a manicured finger inches from my face. Look around you. Look at the custom silk gown you are wearing. Look at the massive diamond ring on your finger. Look at this entire event. You are stepping into a completely different world today, and you need to start acting like you belong in this tax bracket. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air between us. Act like I belong in this tax bracket. If he only knew the truth, he would be on his knees begging for my mercy. My family is letting you marry into an empire, he sneered, leaning in closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. Do you have any idea the doors my last name will open for you? Do you have any concept of the power and prestige my mother holds in this city? We are giving you the ultimate gift. We are giving you status. And instead of showing some basic gratitude, you are in here making demands and defending a man who does not even know which fork to use for his salad. I stared up into his eyes, searching for any lingering trace of the man I loved. There was nothing, just pure entitlement and blinding ignorance. In that exact moment, the final thread of my emotional attachment to him snapped completely. The grieving, disappointed bride died right there on the Persian rug. The ruthless senior partner of Apex Capital Management officially took the wheel. Kendrick thought he was putting me in my place. He thought he was exerting his dominance as the wealthy provider. He had absolutely no idea that every single word leaving his mouth was signing his own financial death warrant. He was demanding gratitude for an empire that I legally owned. He was boasting about a tax bracket while I was holding the deed to his mother's house and the pink slip to his brother's car. I let out a slow, steady breath. The tension completely left my shoulders. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt surgical. You know what, Kendrick, I said, my voice perfectly calm, devoid of any emotion whatsoever. You make an excellent point. He blinked, surprised by my sudden shift in tone. He lowered his hand, a smug, arrogant smile returning to his face. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully bullied me back into submission. I am glad you finally see reason, Zoya, he said, adjusting his bow tie. Now go into the bathroom, touch up your makeup, and wipe that miserable look off your face. We need to go back out there and cut the cake. I reached behind me and unlocked the deadbolt. The heavy brass mechanism clicked loudly in the quiet room. I pulled the mahogany door open, letting the sound of the jazz band flood back into the suite. I am not going to fix my makeup, I told him, stepping out into the hallway. Kendrick frowned, taking a step after me. Then what exactly are you doing? He demanded, his voice tightening with a sudden hint of nervous uncertainty. I looked over my shoulder and offered him a chilling, perfectly empty smile. I am going to do exactly what you just asked me to do, Kendrick. I am going to act like I belong in my tax bracket, and I am going to go out there and show your mother exactly what true power and prestige look like. I turned away from him and began walking down the hallway toward the ballroom. I did not look back to see if he was following me. My target was the center stage, and I was ready to drop the match on their entire world. The heavy mahogany door of the bridal suite clicked shut behind me, sealing Kendrick's fate inside that room. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway leading back to the main ballroom. Every step I took felt lighter than the last. The heavy, suffocating weight of trying to be the perfect, accommodating bride had completely vanished. I was no longer trying to shrink myself to fit into their absurd little boxes. I was expanding, taking up every single inch of space I rightfully deserved. As I approached the grand entrance of the Oak Creek Country Club ballroom, the familiar sounds of the reception washed over me. The 10-piece jazz band was playing a lively, upbeat tune. Waiters in crisp white shirts were weaving through the tables, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne and expensive desserts. The air smelled of roasted meat and imported white orchids. It was a picture-perfect scene of high society indulgence. I stepped through the arched doorway, and the soft glow of the crystal chandeliers hit my face. Several guests seated near the back turned to look at me, their faces softened into polite, expectant smiles. They saw the bride returning from a private moment with her groom. They fully expected me to walk back to the head table, dab my eyes with a silk tissue, and deliver a tearful speech thanking my new family for their incredible generosity. They expected a performance of profound gratitude. They were ready to applaud the poor girl who had just won the matrimonial lottery. I did not walk toward the head table. I did not look for my seat next to the towering multi-tiered wedding cake. I bypassed the VIP section entirely. I walked with purpose. The heavy silk train of my custom gown glided silently over the polished hardwood floor. I passed by the extended family tables. I saw Chloe leaning over to whisper something into the ear of a wealthy local socialite, holding up her wrist so the stolen Cartier watch caught the light perfectly. I saw Trey throwing back another glass of expensive scotch, laughing entirely too loudly at a joke he probably did not even understand. They were completely oblivious to the hurricane that was currently walking right past them. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead. I was heading directly for the raised stage at the far end of the dance floor. The lead singer of the jazz band, a tall man in a sharp velvet suit, was holding the wireless microphone swaying to the rhythm of the music. He saw me approaching and offered a warm professional smile, expecting me to request a specific song or make a brief announcement about the cake cutting. I did not stop at the edge of the dance floor. I walked right up the 3 carpeted steps onto the stage. I stepped directly into his personal space and held out my hand. The singer paused, his smile faltering slightly in confusion. He looked at my outstretched hand and then up at my face. He must have seen the absolute cold calculation in my eyes, because he did not argue. He simply stopped singing and handed me the heavy metal microphone. I turned around to face the massive ballroom. I stood dead center on the stage, directly under the brightest spotlight in the room. The sudden absence of the lead singer's voice caused the rest of the band members to slowly stop playing their instruments one by one. The upbeat jazz melody dissolved into a few scattered, awkward notes before dying out completely. The sudden silence in the room was immediate and heavy. It rippled outward from the stage, washing over the 300 guests. The clinking of silverware against fine china stopped. The quiet murmurs of high society gossip faded away. Every single face in the crowd turned toward me. I tapped the microphone twice with my manicured fingernail. The sharp, rhythmic thud echoed loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system, commanding absolute attention. I stood tall, squaring my shoulders. I did not fidget. I did not nervously smooth down my dress or clear my throat. I stood with the perfect rigid posture of a woman who was absolutely comfortable holding the fate of an entire bloodline in the palm of her hand. I let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. I forced them to sit in the uncomfortable quiet. I forced them to wait on me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Kendrick finally emerge from the hallway. He stepped into the ballroom looking slightly disheveled and frantic. He immediately spotted me standing on the stage holding the microphone. The color completely drained from his face. He took a hesitant step forward, his mouth opening slightly, but he did not dare speak. He knew exactly what he had unleashed in that bridal suite, and he was entirely powerless to stop it now. I did not look at him. Kendrick was no longer my primary target. He was just collateral damage. I cast my gaze across the sea of faces, ignoring the local politicians, the wealthy investors, and the country club elite. My eyes locked directly onto Vivian. She was standing near the front of the dance floor, holding a fresh martini glass. She had perfectly positioned herself in the center of her affluent friends, soaking up their continued praise for her beautiful speech. When she saw me standing on the stage, her posture stiffened slightly. A faint, condescending smile played at the corners of her perfectly painted lips. She tilted her chin up, adopting the benevolent maternal expression she had perfected over decades of social climbing. She truly believed I was standing up there to validate her narrative. She thought I was going to cry. She thought I was going to thank her for rescuing me from my blue-collar life. She was ready to accept my public submission. I stared down at her from the stage. I looked at the heavy string of South Sea pearls resting against her collarbone. I looked at her expensive silver designer gown. I looked at the utter arrogance radiating from her every pore. I saw a woman who had spent her entire adult life crushing other people beneath her designer heels simply to make herself feel taller. I saw a woman who had looked at my hardworking, honorable father and decided he was nothing more than an ugly prop ruining her perfect aesthetic. The absolute audacity of her existence fueled the fire burning quietly in my chest. She had built an entire reality based on lies, manipulation, and stolen money. She had weaponized her fake wealth to humiliate the people I loved most in this world. I raised the microphone to my lips. I did not let my voice shake. I did not let a single ounce of emotion bleed into my tone. I spoke with the clear, sharp authority of a corporate executioner reading a final verdict. "Thank you, Vivian." I began, my voice ringing out crystal clear across the silent ballroom. The corners of Vivian's smile widened just a fraction. She took a slow, graceful sip of her martini, assuming the victory lap was officially beginning. She nodded her head slightly, a silent gesture of royal acceptance. I let her enjoy that feeling of supreme power for exactly 2 more seconds. I let her stand at the absolute peak of her imaginary mountain, because I knew that the fall from the top was going to completely shatter her. "Thank you," I continued, never breaking eye contact with the matriarch of the fake empire for making it so incredibly easy for me to burn this entire illusion to the ground. The smile on Vivian's face froze instantly. The martini glass in her hand trembled slightly. The polite murmurs of agreement from the crowd died in their throats, replaced by a sudden, sharp collective gasp of pure confusion. The perfectly choreographed country club wedding reception had just violently jumped the tracks, and every single person in that room was suddenly trapped on the ride. I watched the realization slowly wash over Vivian's perfectly contoured face. She did not know exactly what was coming yet, but the primal instinct of self-preservation was already making her step backward. The guests were completely paralyzed, waiting for the punchline of a joke that did not exist. I tightened my grip on the microphone. The time for biting my tongue was officially over. "You spoke so beautifully about your family legacy, Vivian," I said, my voice carrying a cold, clinical authority that demanded absolute silence. "You used the word empire multiple times during your toast. It is a very strong word. It implies power, stability, and generational wealth. It implies a foundation so solid that it can afford to be generous to those less fortunate. But the truth is, you do not have an empire. You have a mountain of past due notices hidden in the top drawer of your antique mahogany desk." I paused, letting those words hang in the air. The absolute stillness in the ballroom was suffocating. I could see the exact moment the meaning of my words registered in the minds of her elite country club friends. I want to tell everyone here tonight the exact state of that empire. I continued pacing slowly across the front of the stage. "Because for the last 8 months, your family has been completely and utterly bankrupt." The collective gasp from the 300 guests was so loud it sounded like all the oxygen had been suddenly sucked out of the room. The polite, sophisticated facade of the reception shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces. The wealthy socialites who had just been praising Vivian's elegance were now staring at her with wide, horrified eyes. The mayor, whom Vivian had been aggressively buttering up all evening, slowly set his crystal champagne flute down on the nearest table and took a distinct physical step away from her, as if financial ruin were a highly contagious airborne disease. Vivian's face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray under the bright lights of the chandelier. The smug, condescending smile was completely wiped away, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her hands began to shake so violently that the silver martini glass slipped from her manicured fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a sharp crash, sending expensive liquor and shards of glass scattering across the dance floor. She did not even look down. She just stood there paralyzed, staring up at me. "Let us start with this family estate," I announced, projecting my voice to reach the very back of the room. "The sprawling colonial mansion where you host your annual charity galas to impress the neighborhood. It has 2 massive defaulted mortgages. The bank issued a final notice of foreclosure 3 weeks ago. You have exactly 28 days before the sheriff's department physically removes your designer furniture from the premises and padlocks the front doors. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, morphing from shocked whispers into aggressive, scandalous gossip. I could see prominent local investors exchanging furious glances. Old money hates nothing more than the stench of poverty disguising itself as wealth. They felt duped, and in their world being made to look foolish was the ultimate unforgivable sin. "And let us talk about tonight," I said, gesturing broadly to the lavish decorations surrounding us. "This gorgeous $100,000 reception. The imported white orchids, the 10-piece jazz band, the top-shelf liquor flowing at the open bar. You stood on this stage and acted like you graciously wrote a check out of your massive trust fund to welcome me into your exclusive world. You wanted everyone to believe you were doing my family a favor by paying for my seat at the table." I leaned forward slightly, resting my free hand on my hip. "But there is no trust fund, Vivian. This entire wedding was not funded by generational wealth. It was funded by a high-interest corporate credit card attached to a failing business account. A credit card that was completely maxed out yesterday afternoon just to pay the final catering deposit. You are hosting the society event of the season on stolen borrowed time." Kendrick finally snapped out of his shock. He broke through the crowd near the edge of the dance floor, his face flushed a dark, angry red. "Zoya, shut your mouth!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Someone cut the microphone. She is lying. She is completely delusional." He tried to rush the stage, but the velvet-suited lead singer of the jazz band immediately stepped in front of the stairs, blocking his path. Two other groomsmen instinctively grabbed Kendrick's arms, holding him back. He struggled against them, looking like a frantic, desperate child throwing a tantrum. "I am not lying, Kendrick," I said, looking down at my furious husband with absolute disgust. "I am a senior partner at a private equity firm. My entire career is built on analyzing distressed assets and corporate liquidations. I know exactly what bankruptcy looks like because I dissect it every single day of my life. And your family is the most pathetic textbook case of financial ruin I have ever seen. I ran a full forensic audit on your entire portfolio 3 weeks ago. I have every bank statement, every past due notice, and every federal tax lien memorized." I shifted my gaze back to Vivian, who was now leaning heavily against a cocktail table for physical support. Her breathing was shallow and erratic. The pearls around her neck suddenly looked like a heavy chain dragging her down to the bottom of the ocean. "You called me a charity case, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that echoed clearly through the silent room. "You looked at my father, a man who owns his home outright, a man who has zero debt and a full city pension, and you called him a peasant. You mocked him for wearing a transit uniform. You shoved him into a dark corner by the kitchen doors because you thought his honest, calloused hands would ruin the aesthetic of your fake high society photos." I walked to the very edge of the stage, looking directly down into her terrified eyes. "You thought you could use my family to make yourself feel superior. You assumed because I did not flaunt designer labels or brag about my bank account that I was just a naive little girl desperate for your approval. You thought I would be too intimidated by your fake wealth to ever question the reality behind it. You thought you could bully me into shrinking myself so your fragile ego could take up more room." Vivian opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked around desperately, pleading silently for one of her wealthy friends to step in and defend her. But nobody moved. The local politicians and real estate developers just stared at her with expressions of cold judgment. In the span of 3 minutes, she had been completely stripped of her social standing. Her entire identity was built on being the wealthiest woman in the room, and I had just publicly revealed that she was actually the poorest. "But you picked the wrong bride, Vivian." I told her, the absolute certainty of my victory ringing in every syllable. "You did not rescue me from the wrong side of the tracks. I walked into this family carrying enough capital to buy and sell your entire bloodline 3 times over." The crowd erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and frantic conversations. People were physically stepping away from the family tables, treating the in-laws like they were radioactive. The illusion was completely dead. The grand empire had been burned to the ground, and there was nothing left but ashes and unpaid bills. But I was not finished. Exposing the macro level of their bankruptcy was just the beginning. I had specific precision strikes left to deliver. I turned my attention away from the broken matriarch and locked my eyes onto the head table where the real criminals were hiding. I turned my gaze away from Vivian and focused entirely on the massive floral-draped head table. Trey was sitting rigidly in his gilded chair. The arrogant, confident chief executive officer who had spent the entire evening swirling expensive scotch and pitching fake business expansions to the mayor was completely gone. In his place was a terrified little boy staring at me like I was holding a loaded weapon. I walked slowly to the edge of the stage, pointing a single manicured finger directly at him. "Trey," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "You have been walking around this reception all night shaking hands and soliciting capital. You actually had the nerve to look the mayor in the eye an hour ago and tell him your logistics company was ready to expand into new warehouses downtown." The mayor, who was standing a few feet away, whipped his head around to glare at Trey. The look of utter betrayal on the politician's face was absolutely priceless. He quickly stepped back, physically distancing himself from the head table as if financial fraud was a contagious disease. "Let us talk about those warehouses, Trey." I continued pacing back and forth under the spotlight. "Let us talk about the fact that your company has not posted a single dollar of profit in 24 consecutive months. You do not own a logistics empire. You operate a sinking ship. Your freight trucks are heavily mortgaged. Your diesel fuel lines of credit were cut off last Tuesday. You have dozens of independent contractors who have not seen a paycheck since October. You are actively dodging federal collections calls while sitting here drinking top-shelf liquor that you charge to a corporate account you know you can never pay off." Trey gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He opened his mouth, but he was stammering violently. "Zoya, that is confidential. Corporate information." He finally managed to choke out, his voice cracking under the intense scrutiny of 300 glaring guests. "You cannot just stand up there and say these things. We are just experiencing a temporary cash flow disruption." "A temporary cash flow disruption," I repeated, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the ballroom. "That is a very creative way to describe felony embezzlement." The word embezzlement dropped like a physical bomb in the middle of the dance floor. The wealthy investors Trey had invited, the men he desperately needed to bail him out, began aggressively murmuring to each other. Several of them pulled out their phones immediately, typing out messages, probably instructing their legal teams to sever all ties with his company. Trey looked like he was going to be physically sick. He slumped back in his chair, his chest heaving as the walls of his imaginary fortress crumbled into dust. But I was not going to let him take all the credit. I shifted my focus to the woman sitting right next to him. Chloe was perfectly still. The emerald green designer dress she was wearing suddenly looked like a prison uniform. "And then there is Chloe," I said, my voice softening into a mockingly sweet tone. "My lovely, cultured, sophisticated new sister-in-law." Chloe visibly flinched. She knew exactly what was coming. She had spent the entire evening treating my family like dirt beneath her expensive shoes. She had leaned over her champagne glass just an hour ago and told me my father was too unpolished to sit at the head table. She had played the role of the benevolent, wealthy white savior trying to guide the angry black bride. Earlier tonight, Chloe expressed deep concern that my father might feel intimidated sitting with people of a certain caliber, I announced, projecting my voice so every single person in the back row could hear me perfectly. She called the man who raised me unpolished. She was worried he might use the wrong fork and ruin the high society aesthetic. I stopped pacing and stood dead center, looking right into Chloe's terrified eyes. "Let me tell you all what I consider to be unpolished," I said, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "I consider it incredibly unpolished to siphon money from a failing corporate payroll account to fund your personal shopping habits." Chloe gasped loudly. She instinctively reached across her body with her right hand, desperately trying to grab her left wrist. She started violently tugging at the silk sleeve of her dress, trying to pull the fabric down over her jewelry. It was a pathetic, panicked movement, but it was far too late. "Do not bother hiding it, Chloe," I instructed, my voice commanding and absolute. Everyone here already saw you flashing it around during the cocktail hour. The Panthère de Cartier watch currently sitting on your left wrist. Retail price exactly $25,000. The guest seated near the head table physically recoiled. A prominent female judge sitting just 2 chairs away from Chloe stared at the glittering watch with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. I ran the wire transfers myself, I explained to the captivated audience. 3 days before the bank flagged the logistics company accounts, Chloe authorized a direct transfer of $25,000 from the employee payroll fund into a private offshore limited liability company registered under her maiden name. She literally stole the paychecks of hardworking truck drivers, men and women who looked just like my father, just so she could buy a gold and diamond watch to impress all of you tonight. Trey turned to look at his wife, his jaw dropping in genuine shock. He might have been a terrible businessman and a chronic liar, but the look of betrayal on his face told me he actually had no idea she was directly stealing from the payroll. "Chloe, what did you do?" he hissed, gripping her arm. Chloe yanked her arm away from him, tears of absolute humiliation finally spilling over her perfectly contoured cheeks. "Shut up, Trey," she cried, her voice shrill and desperate. "We had to keep up appearances. Your mother demanded we look the part. I could not show up to this wedding looking like we were broke." "You did not just look broke, Chloe," I interrupted, cutting off her pathetic excuses. "You looked like a parasite. You married into this family and decided the best way to secure your status was to step on anyone you deemed beneath you. You thought you could parade around dripping in stolen diamonds while looking down your nose at a man who worked 30 years of honest, grueling labor. My father has more class in his calloused hands than you will ever have in your entire miserable life." The ballroom was completely, utterly silent except for the sound of Chloe's ragged sobbing. She had completely collapsed in her chair, hiding her face in her hands. The glittering Cartier watch was still visible, catching the light of the chandeliers, serving as a permanent glowing beacon of her absolute fraud. Trey was staring blankly at the tablecloth, realizing that his business, his marriage, and his freedom were all evaporating simultaneously. They were destroyed. The fake chief executive and his society wife were reduced to nothing more than common thieves in front of the most powerful people in the city. The investors they had desperately courted were now looking at them like they were infectious. The illusion of the golden brother and the perfect sister-in-law was completely dead and buried under the weight of their own greed. I took a deep breath, letting the heavy silence stretch out for another moment. I wanted them to feel the crushing weight of the public humiliation. I wanted them to know exactly how my father felt when they shoved him into the dark corner by the kitchen doors. I had successfully dismantled the matriarch, and I had completely ruined the golden child and his wife. But the execution was not over yet. I still had one final layer of this fake empire to tear down. I still had the man I married. I turned my head slowly, adjusting my grip on the microphone. Kendrick was still standing at the edge of the dance floor, restrained by his own groomsmen, staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. It was time for him to understand exactly who he had married. Kendrick wrenched his arms free from the 2 groomsmen who had been holding him back. The sheer panic in his chest had finally overridden his shock. He sprinted across the polished hardwood of the dance floor, his custom leather shoes slipping slightly before he lunged up the 3 carpeted steps onto the stage. He reached out with both hands, aggressively swiping at the microphone I was holding. I simply took one smooth step backward, letting him grasp nothing but empty air. He stumbled forward, his chest heaving as he turned to face the silent crowd. "She is completely delusional!" he screamed, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. He threw his arms out wide, trying to block me from the view of the audience. "My wife is having a severe mental breakdown. The stress of the wedding planning has caused her to snap. None of what she is saying is true. She works a basic middle management job in a cubicle downtown. She does not know anything about corporate finance or our family accounts. She is just acting out because she feels intimidated by all of you." He turned back to me, his eyes wide and wild like a cornered animal. "Give me the microphone right now, Zoya," he hissed through clenched teeth, dropping his voice so only I could hear. "You have done enough damage. I am going to have security escort you to a hospital." I looked at the man who was actively trying to gaslight a room of 300 people just to save his own fragile ego. It was pathetic. It was the last desperate gasp of a dying illusion. He truly believed that if he shouted loud enough, he could force reality to bend back to his comfortable lies. I did not hand him the microphone. Instead, I reached into the hidden pocket of my custom silk wedding gown and pulled out my smartphone. Earlier in the evening, while the bridal party was taking photos, I had slipped the venue audio-visual technician a $100 bill to grant my phone wireless access to the massive digital projector suspended from the ceiling. It was originally supposed to be used for a sappy slideshow of our childhood photos before we cut the cake. I had a much better presentation in mind. I tapped the screen, mirroring my display directly to the venue's system. A blinding white light suddenly flared behind us. The massive wall screen spanning 20 feet across illuminated the dark ballroom. Kendrick flinched at the sudden brightness, turning around to shield his eyes. The entire audience shifted their gaze upward, completely mesmerized by the sudden glow. It was not a photo of us smiling on a beach. It was a heavily redacted, legally binding financial document. The bold black text stood out sharply against the glaring white background, bearing the official seals of federal bankruptcy courts and high-level corporate banking institutions. Kendrick is right about one thing, I said, raising the microphone again, so my voice boomed effortlessly over his frantic breathing. I let him believe I was just a mid-level manager. I let his family believe I sat in a cubicle running basic spreadsheets. I intentionally downplayed my career because I wanted to be loved for who I am, not for the capital I control. I wanted a husband who valued my heart, not my portfolio. I wanted a family that respected me without needing to see my bank statements first. I clicked a button on my phone and the massive screen zoomed in on the top section of the document. But I am not a middle manager, I announced, the absolute authority returning to my voice. My name is Zoya, and I am the senior partner and majority shareholder of Apex Capital Management. The murmurs started again, this time laced with genuine awe from the business professionals in the room. Apex Capital Management was not a small boutique firm. It was a heavyweight in the financial sector, known for ruthlessly acquiring and liquidating distressed assets. The local investors who had been shunning trade just moments ago were now staring at me with a mixture of shock and deep professional respect. I tapped the screen again, pulling up a certified statement of my personal net worth. The numbers were staggering. A clear, documented 8-figure fortune that eclipsed anything Kendrick's family had ever possessed, even in their prime. You spent this entire evening telling me to act like I belong in your tax bracket. Kendrick, I said, stepping around him to stand directly in front of the massive screen. You demanded that I show gratitude for being allowed into your empire, but my personal net worth is currently sitting at $42 million. I do not just belong in your tax bracket. I could buy your entire tax bracket in cash tomorrow morning and still have enough left over to tear down your mother's house and build a parking lot. Kendrick's jaw literally dropped. His eyes darted back and forth between my face and the verified financial documents projected on the wall. The arrogant, aggressive man who had just tried to diagnose me with a mental breakdown was completely paralyzed. His brain was short-circuiting, trying to process the impossible reality that the woman his mother had just publicly branded a charity case was actually a multimillionaire. Down on the floor, Vivian let out a soft, whimpering sound and sank into a nearby chair, completely unable to support her own weight. Chloe was staring at the screen, her tear-streaked face frozen in a mask of absolute horror. They were realizing the magnitude of the mistake they had made. But that is not even the best part of my presentation. I continued pacing slowly across the stage, the heavy silk of my dress rustling behind me. I swiped to the final slide. A new document appeared on the screen. It was the master ledger of the debt acquisition I had authorized 3 weeks ago. You see, when I realized your family was completely bankrupt, I did not run away, I explained, looking directly into Kendrick's terrified eyes. I did what I do best. I capitalized on an opportunity. 3 weeks ago, Apex Capital Management quietly purchased every single piece of your family's defaulted corporate and personal debt from your terrified creditors. I pointed to the massive screen highlighting the specific line items for the entire room to read. I own the 2 defaulted mortgages on Vivian's estate. I own the crushing corporate debt weighing down Trey's logistics company. I own the financing contracts on the leased luxury cars you and your brother drove to this country club tonight. I am your single largest creditor. I own you. Kendrick stumbled backward, physically retreating from the words coming out of my mouth. He bumped into a microphone stand, knocking it over with a loud metallic crash, but nobody flinched. The crowd was completely transfixed by the corporate slaughter happening on stage. You told me I needed to accept how things worked in your world. I reminded him, quoting the exact words he had used in the bridal suite. You told me your family was giving me the ultimate gift of status, but the only thing your family gave me was a massive tax write-off. I walked right up to him. He was trembling violently. Actual tears were welling up in his eyes, replacing the arrogant swagger he had carried for the last 2 years. He finally understood. He finally realized that he had spent the last 24 hours disrespecting the very woman who held the absolute power to save his family from complete and utter ruin. I was going to forgive the debt, Kendrick, I whispered into the microphone, making sure every single person in the room heard the final devastating truth. I bought your debt as a wedding gift. I was going to quietly clear the ledgers and save your family from prison and foreclosure because I thought you loved me. I was willing to use my hard-earned wealth to protect your fraudulent bloodline from the consequences of their own greed. I looked past him toward the dark corner by the kitchen doors. My father was no longer looking down at his lap. He was standing up tall, his shoulders squared, watching me with an expression of profound pride. But then you shoved my father next to the swinging kitchen doors, I said, my voice hardening into solid, unbreakable ice. You laughed while your mother called him a peasant. You stood by while your sister-in-law mocked his calloused hands. You chose your fake high society aesthetic over basic human decency, and that is a debt I will never forgive. I took a deliberate step backward, putting physical distance between myself and the man who was currently trembling in his custom tuxedo. The absolute silence in the room amplified the sound of my voice as I delivered the final verdict. I had the legal discharge papers drawn up on Friday afternoon, Kendrick. I told him, my tone completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. All I had to do was sign those documents on Monday morning. If you had just shown my father an ounce of basic respect, your family would have been entirely debt-free by the end of the week. Vivian would have kept her sprawling colonial mansion. Trey would have kept his failing company, and Chloe could have kept her stolen watch. You all would have kept your precious fake prestige, and nobody in this room would have ever known the truth. I watched the devastating reality of his massive mistake wash over his face. He had held the winning lottery ticket in his hands, and he had set it on fire just to appease his mother's arrogant ego. But you proved to me tonight that you do not deserve a single ounce of my grace. I continued, my voice ringing with finality. You proved that your entire family is fundamentally toxic. You are all parasites feeding on the illusion of superiority while offering absolutely nothing of value to the world. Therefore, the grace period I quietly extended to your accounts is officially over. Effective immediately, I am calling in every single cent of your family's debt. Kendrick opened his mouth, but a choked, breathless sound was all that came out. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows who had just heard the lever pull. I turned my back on my husband and walked toward the edge of the stage, locking my eyes on the head table. Trey was still sitting there, paralyzed, staring at the pristine white tablecloth. He looked like he had rapidly aged 10 years in the last 5 minutes. Trey, I called out, forcing him to look up at me. When my firm purchased the commercial loans keeping your logistics company afloat, we also acquired the specific covenants attached to them. As your primary debt holder, Apex Capital Management holds the contractual right to immediately replace executive leadership in the event of gross financial negligence and suspected embezzlement. Trey shook his head weakly, a pathetic attempt at denial. Zoya, you cannot do this, he mumbled, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. It is my company. My father built it. Your father built it, and you completely destroyed it, I corrected him sharply. And according to the legal paperwork I filed 48 hours ago, it is no longer your company. As of this exact moment, you are officially terminated from your position as Chief Executive Officer. The investors who had been sitting near the front tables let out low whistles of shock. A hostile corporate takeover executed live at a wedding reception was something none of them had ever witnessed. Do not even bother going to the warehouse on Monday morning, I instructed him. While you were sitting here drinking top-shelf liquor and pitching fraudulent expansions to the mayor, my team was at your corporate headquarters. The security codes have been changed. The corporate bank accounts are frozen. The locks on your corner office have been replaced. Building security has already been instructed to physically escort you off the premises if you step foot on the property. Trey frantically patted the pockets of his tuxedo, pulling out his smartphone. His face turned completely gray as he stared at the screen. He had over 36 missed calls and frantic text messages from his operations manager and building security. The reality of his termination was sitting right there in his notifications. He dropped the phone onto the table, letting it clatter against the fine china. Chloe let out a sharp, terrified wail. She grabbed Trey's arm, shaking him violently. "Tell me she is lying." "Trey," she shrieked, her carefully crafted socialite persona completely dissolving into chaotic panic. "Tell me we still have the company. How are we going to pay for my credit cards? How are we going to pay the country club dues?" I looked at the weeping woman with absolute disgust. "Since we are on the subject of your lifestyle, Chloe, let us talk about your transportation," I said, cutting through her hysterics. "You and Trey drove a leased Porsche Cayenne to the venue tonight. Vivian drove a Mercedes G-Class. Both of those luxury vehicles were leased under the logistics company name." Chloe stopped shaking her husband and stared at me, her mouth hanging open. "Since the company is in severe default, and you have been actively using corporate funds to finance your personal luxury, those vehicles are now subject to immediate asset recovery," I explained calmly. "I do not tolerate the misappropriation of my corporate collateral." I gestured broadly with my free hand, pointing toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the back of the ballroom that overlooked the circular valet parking lot. "If anyone cares to look outside, you will see exactly how Apex Capital Management handles delinquent accounts," I announced. A wave of movement swept through the ballroom as dozens of guests, including the mayor and several prominent judges, turned in their chairs to look out the grand windows. Through the thick glass, the flashing yellow strobe lights of 3 heavy-duty tow trucks were clearly visible, cutting through the dark night. Uniformed repossession agents were already in the valet lot, actively hooking up the sleek black Porsche and the silver Mercedes. The valet attendants were standing off to the side, completely bewildered, watching the luxury cars being winched onto the flatbeds. A collective murmur of absolute shock rippled through the wealthy crowd. To see physical assets seized in real time was the ultimate confirmation of my absolute authority. It was a brutal, undeniable display of power. "No," Chloe screamed, jumping up from her chair and pointing a shaking finger at the windows. "You cannot take my car. My designer luggage is in the trunk. Stop them, Trey. Do something." Trey did not move. He just buried his face in his hands, entirely broken. Down on the floor, Vivian let out a long, agonizing moan. She slumped over in her chair, completely unresponsive to the chaos around her. The proud, arrogant matriarch who had commanded the room just 20 minutes ago was now a hollow shell. Her country club friends, the people she had spent her entire life trying to impress, were actively turning their backs on her. The social isolation was instantaneous and permanent. Kendrick finally found his voice. He rushed to the edge of the stage, grabbing the hem of my heavy silk gown. "Zoya, please," he begged, his voice cracking with tears. "We are married. You are my wife. You cannot do this to your own family. We are legally bound." I looked down at the man kneeling at my feet. He was actually trying to use the sacred vows we had just taken as a shield to protect his fraudulent empire. He thought the marriage certificate would somehow obligate me to save him from the mess he created. I reached down and firmly pulled the silk fabric out of his desperate grasp. "Our marriage certificate does not erase your corporate debt, Kendrick," I told him, my voice cold and unyielding. "And I am not doing anything to you. I am simply enforcing the legal contracts your family signed. I am protecting my financial interests." I took a slow, deep breath, looking out over the silent, terrified crowd, and then back down to my husband. You wanted me to act like I belong in my tax bracket, Kendrick. I am just following your instructions. This is exactly how the real titans of industry operate. We do not make scenes and we do not throw tantrums. We just buy the ground beneath your feet and swallow you whole. I held Kendrick's gaze for one long final second before I reached for my left hand. I placed my thumb and index finger over the massive 3-carat diamond engagement ring he had proposed with. The ring he had so proudly told my father was an heirloom purchased from an exclusive jeweler in Europe. I slid the heavy platinum band off my finger. I held the ring out, hovering it directly over the half-empty crystal tumbler of bourbon Kendrick was still clutching in his trembling hand. I do not need your status, Kendrick, I told him, my voice steady and resolute. And I certainly do not need your family. I opened my fingers. The heavy diamond dropped into the amber liquid. It sank to the bottom of the crystal glass with a distinct sharp clink that somehow echoed above the frantic murmurs of the crowd. Kendrick stared down at the glass in his hand as if the ring inside it were a venomous snake. He was completely defeated, stripped of his false bravado, and left holding nothing but the physical evidence of his failure. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on the man I had almost tied my life to and began walking away. I stepped down from the raised stage, the heavy silk train of my wedding gown trailing behind me like a victory banner. The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide, clear path for me. The wealthy investors, the local politicians, the judgmental society friends, they all stepped back, their eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and newfound respect. I was no longer the unpolished charity case they had whispered about during cocktail hour. I was the executioner, and they were actively trying to avoid the splatter. I walked straight past the head table. I did not even glance at Trey, who was still sitting with his face buried in his hands, or at Chloe, who was now openly weeping as she watched the tow trucks hauling away her stolen luxury cars through the back windows. I walked past Vivian, who was still slumped in her chair, a broken, shattered shell of the arrogant matriarch she had been an hour ago. I headed directly for the dark corner by the swinging kitchen doors. My father was standing exactly where I had left him, but he was no longer hunching his shoulders or trying to make himself small. He was standing tall, his chest out, his head held high. A slow, proud smile spread across his weathered face as I approached him. "Are you ready to go, Dad?" I asked him, holding out my arm. He looked at my outstretched arm and then up at my face. His eyes were shining with a profound, fierce pride that completely erased any lingering trace of the humiliation Vivian had tried to force upon him. "I am ready, baby," he said, his rough voice thick with emotion. "Let us get out of here." He linked his arm through mine, resting his calloused hand gently against my silk sleeve. We turned together and began walking toward the grand entrance of the ballroom. We walked with the slow, measured dignity of royalty, leaving a conquered territory. As we approached the heavy mahogany doors leading out to the main lobby, I spotted the venue manager. He was a nervous-looking man with a clipboard who had been frantically hovering near the exit, watching the entire corporate slaughter unfold with wide, terrified eyes. I paused right in front of him. "Excuse me," I said, my voice projecting clearly so that Kendrick and his family could hear every single word. The manager flinched slightly, clutching his clipboard to his chest. "Yes, Mom," he stammered, his eyes darting nervously between me and the silent ballroom behind us. "How can I help you?" "I need to inform you of a sudden change in billing," I announced, my tone completely businesslike. "The black corporate credit card that was placed on file this morning to cover the $150,000 catering and venue balance. I just officially reported it as a stolen corporate asset. The bank has already canceled the card and frozen the associated accounts." The manager's face instantly went pale. "But Mom," he started, his voice rising in panic. "We have already served the appetizers. The open bar has been running for 2 hours. Who is going to settle the final invoice?" I turned my head slowly, looking back over my shoulder into the ballroom. Kendrick was still standing near the stage, staring at me with a look of absolute sheer panic. "You need to speak to the groom and his mother," I told the manager, my voice carrying over the dead silence of the crowd. "They are the hosts of this magnificent event." Vivian assured everyone tonight that she is a woman of immense wealth and gracious generosity. I am absolutely certain she will be more than happy to write you a personal check to cover the balance of her precious aesthetic. I turned back to the manager, offering him a tight, entirely unsympathetic smile. I would advise you to collect payment before they leave the building, though. They have a terrible habit of defaulting on their financial obligations. The manager swallowed hard, nodding frantically, as he immediately began marching toward Vivian and Kendrick, holding his clipboard like a shield. I did not stay to watch the final confrontation over the catering bill. I had delivered the killing blow, and the resulting fallout was no longer my concern. I tightened my grip on my father's arm and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors. We stepped out of the stifling, oppressive atmosphere of the Oak Creek Country Club and into the cool, crisp night air. The sudden quiet of the empty parking lot felt like a physical relief. The only sound was the distant hum of the tow trucks driving away with Chloe's stolen Mercedes. I looked down at my massive custom wedding gown. It was a beautiful dress, but it felt heavy now, saturated with the toxic expectations of a family I had just completely dismantled. I reached back, unfastening the intricate buttons, holding the long silk train in place, and let the heavy fabric drop onto the pavement. I did not care that it was getting dirty. I was leaving the dead weight behind me. My dad pulled his keys out of the pocket of his rented tuxedo. My reliable, sensible sedan was parked near the back of the lot, far away from the valet stand, where the luxury cars had just been repossessed. We walked to the car together, our footsteps echoing in the quiet night. He opened the passenger door for me, a gentle, familiar gesture he had done a million times before. I sank into the comfortable fabric seat, letting out a long, exhausted sigh. My father slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. He did not turn the radio on. He just sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, looking straight ahead out the windshield. "Zoya," he said quietly, his voice rough and steady, "I have always been proud of you. Since the day you were born, I knew you were going to do incredible things. But tonight—" He paused, shaking his head slowly. "Tonight you showed me what true strength looks like. You did not just defend yourself, baby. You defended our name." I reached across the center console and placed my hand over his calloused knuckles. "I learned it from watching you, Dad." I told him the absolute truth, ringing in my words. "I learned that you never let anyone make you feel small in your own life." He turned to look at me, a warm, genuine smile finally breaking across his face. He put the car in gear and slowly pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the glowing facade of the Oak Creek Country Club behind us in the rearview mirror. We drove away from the wreckage of the fake empire, away from the toxic vanity of a family that had tried to consume us. I did not feel a single ounce of regret for what I had done. I had walked into that building as an accommodating bride, and I was driving away as an apex predator who had successfully protected her own. The war was officially over, and the silence in the car felt like absolute profound victory. 6 months later, the dust had completely settled on the ruins of the fake empire I had dismantled at my own wedding reception. The fallout was just as absolute and devastating as I had promised it would be. When I filed the liquidation paperwork on Monday morning following the wedding, the entire foundation of their fraudulent existence completely collapsed under the weight of its own reality. I was sitting in my corner office at Apex Capital Management, sipping a fresh cup of coffee and looking out at the city skyline when my assistant handed me the final closure report on their accounts. Reading through those legal documents was profoundly satisfying. Vivian was the first to fall. True to my word, I refused to grant any extensions on the 2 defaulted mortgages holding up her sprawling colonial estate. The sheriff's department arrived on a Tuesday morning with the official eviction notice. She tried to call her wealthy country club friends to secure an emergency loan, but the news of her public humiliation had already spread through their elite circles like a wildfire. Nobody answered her calls. Old money does not associate with public embarrassment. The bank seized the property, and Vivian was forced to quickly downsize. The woman who had proudly called my father a peasant from the wrong side of the tracks was now living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a distinctly average neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. She had to sell most of her designer furniture and her heavy string of South Sea pearls just to cover the security deposit. She no longer hosted charity galas or bragged about her legacy. She spent her days aggressively avoiding anyone who might recognize her from her former life of luxury. Trey fared even worse. The immediate termination of his position as chief executive officer sent shockwaves through the logistics industry. The corporate bank accounts were completely frozen, and the federal authorities quickly stepped in to audit the remains of the business. When they discovered the extent of the financial mismanagement and the blatant embezzlement, the criminal charges were swiftly filed. He managed to avoid actual prison time by pleading guilty to corporate fraud and agreeing to massive restitution payments, but his professional reputation was permanently destroyed. He was now legally barred from holding any executive or fiduciary position ever again. And Chloe, of course, did exactly what parasites always do when the host dies. She jumped ship. The very second she realized the logistics company was gone and the bank accounts were inaccessible, she filed for divorce. She cited irreconcilable differences, but everyone knew the real reason. She could not stomach the idea of being married to a broke man. The irony was that because the Panthère de Cartier watch and her designer bags were purchased with stolen corporate funds, they were seized as collateral during the bankruptcy proceedings. She walked away from the marriage with absolutely nothing, forced to move back into her parents' basement without a single piece of the high society armor she had relied on to feel superior. But Kendrick's reality was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. He had stood in that bridal suite and demanded that I show gratitude for the lifestyle his family was providing. He had told me to act like I belonged in my tax bracket. Now he was desperately trying to survive in a tax bracket he had previously mocked. Because I had legally enforced the collection of his personal debt, including the massive balance on the corporate credit card used to fund our wedding, Kendrick was drowning in financial obligations. He lost his cushy vanity title at the logistics company when I liquidated the assets. With a massive debt hanging over his head and his family name entirely ruined in the local business community, he had to take whatever work he could find. He was currently employed at a grueling entry-level sales job, working 50 hours a week in a sterile cubicle farm just to make the minimum monthly payments on the interest of his debt. The man who had worn custom-tailored Italian tuxedos and drank expensive top-shelf bourbon was now packing a cold lunch and taking the commuter bus to work because his leased luxury car had been repossessed. Every single dollar he earned went directly toward paying back the woman he had tried to humiliate. Their entire social circle, the mayor, the investors, the country club elite, had completely abandoned them. In their world, wealth was the only currency that mattered, and Kendrick's family was completely bankrupt in every possible way. They were entirely isolated, trapped in the miserable reality they had created for themselves. The empire was gone, and they were finally forced to live in the real world. The soft chime of crystal touching crystal brought me back to the present moment. I looked across the wide, spacious aisle of the first-class cabin and smiled at my father. We were currently cruising at 40,000 feet somewhere over the crystalline waters of the Indian Ocean. The stressful, chaotic energy of the last 6 months had completely washed away, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. I raised my glass of vintage champagne toward him, returning his warm, bright smile. We were finally on our way to the Maldives. It was the lavish, tropical retirement trip I had promised him years ago, but we had always pushed it off because he refused to stop working. Now he had no choice. After the wedding disaster, I forcefully retired him. I bought him a beautiful, sprawling property near the coast, far away from the city transit lines, and told him his only job for the rest of his life was to relax. My father took a sip of his drink and looked out the oval window at the endless expanse of blue sky. He was wearing a comfortable tailored linen shirt, leaning back against the plush leather seat of the luxury airline suite. He looked younger, happier, and entirely unburdened. There was no wobbly overflow table. There was no dark corner next to a swinging kitchen door. He was sitting exactly where he belonged, right at the absolute front. I looked down at his hands resting comfortably on the wide armrest. The deep grooves and thick calluses from 30 years of grueling manual labor were still there. They were permanent physical reminders of the sacrifices he had made to ensure I could sit in this exact seat today. Those worn, weathered hands held more genuine dignity, more honor, and more absolute class than Kendrick's entire bloodline ever could. Kendrick's hands were perfectly manicured and soft, but they were weak. They only knew how to swipe stolen credit cards and point fingers. My father's hands had literally built a foundation so strong that no fake empire could ever tear it down. As I sat there listening to the quiet hum of the jet engines, I reflected on what true wealth actually means. Vivian's family believed that wealth was a weapon. They used designer labels, country club memberships, and zip codes as blunt instruments to batter other people into submission. They thought having money meant they were inherently better than everyone else. But their version of wealth was just an elaborate costume hiding a deep, rotting insecurity. They were terrified of being exposed, so they spent their entire lives trying to make people like my father feel small. Real wealth is not about what you wear or where you host your parties. Real wealth is having the absolute freedom to walk away from toxic situations. It is the quiet, unshakable confidence of knowing exactly who you are and knowing that you do not owe a single dime or a single explanation to anybody. I do not use my financial success to intimidate people. I use it as an impenetrable shield to protect the people I love. I use it to ensure that nobody will ever have the power to disrespect my family and get away with it. To all my sisters watching this right now, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Never shrink yourself to fit into an environment that refuses to recognize your actual size. If you have to make yourself smaller, quieter, or less successful just to make a man feel secure, you are in the wrong room. If you have to hide your achievements so his family can maintain their fragile illusions of superiority, you need to pack your bags and leave. Do not ever let anyone convince you that your background is a liability. Do not let them look down on the calloused hands that raised you or the humble beginnings that shaped you. Your roots are exactly what gave you the strength to grow. They are your anchor and your power. The people who try to shame you for where you come from are usually the same people who are absolutely terrified of where you are going. Kendrick and his family tried to put me in my place because they desperately needed me to be beneath them. They wanted a charity case they could control. Instead, they got a corporate executioner who owned their entire reality. They demanded that I act like I belonged in my tax bracket, so I showed them exactly what that looked like. I burned their fraudulent dynasty to the ground, and I did not lose a single night of sleep over it. So keep building your own empires. Keep auditing the rooms you walk into and never ignore the red flags when people show you their true character. Protect your peace, protect your assets, and above all else, protect the people who held you up when you had nothing. My father turned away from the window and raised his glass to me one more time, his eyes shining with pure joy. I clinked my glass against his, taking a long, satisfying sip of the champagne. The clear blue waters of the Maldives were waiting for us, and the horizon had never looked brighter. Stay strong, sisters, and never let a fake empire disrespect your real roots. The greatest lesson I learned from dismantling my in-laws' fake empire is that you must never shrink yourself to fit a room that disrespects your roots. True wealth isn't measured by country club memberships, stolen Cartier watches, or elite zip codes. It is measured by your dignity, your financial independence, and the ironclad boundaries you enforce. When toxic people show you their true colors, do not cry over them. Instead, audit their reality, protect your peace, and hand them the bill. If this story resonated with you, hit subscribe and share it with a sister who needs to remember her absolute power.